Now that we've finished all the valve seats, so they've all been top cut, bottom cut and cleaned, so each one of the processes we did today that you've seen, everything gets cleaned in between. So a good wash, good clean down, get rid of any swarf and metal, dry it all off and go on to the next process. So all the valves have been cut, they're all seating where we want them to seat. So now the next process on installation, before we install it, we need to set up what we call an installed height on Moto Guzzi. Most engines do have something, but these are quite critical. And that's a measurement between where the spring sits on the saddle here and when the top spring retainer is in place with the collets in place. There's a measurement that goes between there. But before we do that, I'll just mention something else to a lot of people. In my years of experience with these engines, particularly when people want to use them for a bit of racing or change the valve springs, these aluminium retainers tend to flare out a little bit. So there's an 8-degree taper inside. So this is not a factory tool. This is, you do lots of competition engines in the past. This is a little tool we've made up for checking to see if they've actually started to flare where the collets sit inside. So the valve collets sit in there like so, and the valve smack in the middle. So this is a little tool I made up to check to see if there's any flaring. Just put it on there, just gently push down, and I just check to see if it wants to rock backwards or forwards. You can actually put bearing blue if you really get fussy and everything else, but I've never ever gone to that extent. Just put it on there, make sure it fits in okay, have a look to see if it's actually got any burrs in it. That's a good one, and I've checked all the others, and this engine's quite good. So I do find some that are a problem, so you need to throw them in the bin. If you leave them when they're loose, what will ultimately happen is they actually will split through here. So worst case scenario, if it all lets go, it'll drop a valve into the engine, and usually that's fairly expensive. So we know they're okay, we're going to do it. Check and install height. So it doesn't matter which one we start. The only criteria I say to everybody, if you're working on the inlet valve or the exhaust valve, whatever the collet you're using for it, it doesn't matter if you've changed them from their original assembly, it doesn't make any difference. But you do, once you set it up, that collet needs to stay over there because there's slight differences in machining on each one of the collets. So we'll just set this in here. Pull the spring retainer back, gently push it down, just make sure it's right home. You can give it a tap with, say, a nylon hammer or something like that, or a little piece of wood, but certainly not with a metal hammer. I mean, maybe we could with it, just a little bit of weight, just to make sure it's seated, but not very hard at all. We know it's seated all the way home. So now we need to measure the distance between where the spring sits on there and underneath there. That measurement from Guzzi is 35.75 to 36 millimetre. So we'll just check this. And I'll need to spin this around to do it the other way. Because we've cut the valves, they've pocketed into the head further, so they're going to be further through. So this will obviously, this distance moving out reduces on-seat valve spring pressure. So it's a fairly critical setting. And this one shows 37.23, and we're allowed a spec of maximum 36 to maybe 35.7. So that's a minimum. We've got to go out about 1.23, 1.25 at least. So in the installation of these, you have two size shims. You have a 1mm shim and a 0.3, but they do vary slightly when you do measure them. So we definitely need a 1mm shim. So to get 36, we need what, about 1.3 or something like that. So that's 1 mil, that one, and that one's, it says it's 0.28. You need to check them. In some spots it shows 2.3, so it must have could have a burr on it. So we've got to start somewhere. So let's put, so the thick one should go to the bottom against the aluminium, and all the adjustment one goes on top. But I have seen them assembled with the thin ones at the bottom and the thick ones on the top. But you really should be assembling it with the big thick one down the bottom. So pop them off. Thick one down, no oil, it should be all nice and clean and dry. not quite in. Sometimes not easy to get and stay in place. Just check our vernier to make sure it's still on 0, which it is. This one shows 35.9, so we're allowed a window of 35.775 to 36, so we'd call this one quits. So that's the sort of target we need. So now you need to set the other ones up as close to that 35.9 as possible. It shouldn't be too far out.
Bill, do you want to tell us why you need to set all the valve springs to the same height?
It's to do with, this sets the loading of the valve spring when the valves are closed. So if we change this, I've forgotten I did have some calculations for every 0.5 of a millimetre on installed how much I did have some whole lot of data I recorded years ago, but I've forgotten. But it does change the amount of poundage the spring holding the valve spring valve collet in place puts out, which then puts a load on your push rod, your rocker arms, down to your cam followers, camshafts. In other words, as the cam goes to lift the cam follower, if it's got to open a rocker arm on one side that's got 80 foot-pounds load on the seat and the other one's got 86, it means that that's dragging horsepower, particularly things like idle. So, you know, people go, oh, but the engine doesn't idle as well as it used to, or it's just a bit off since I rebuilt it, or it may also be just wear and tear. So it is a critical measurement. Also, it's got to do with, if you were using a lot of revs, this on-seat pressure, if we have it too soft and you try to say rev over 8,500, you may find valve bounce would come in at 300 or 400 RPM earlier. It's that critical. And back in the 850 Le Mans days, in the race kit, you used to get a heap of shims like this, and it was a spec to how much to shim your valve springs up to increase the on-seat pressure. Obviously nowadays most people buy some aftermarket spring and put in there. So long as it fits correctly, there's no reason why you can't do it. But just remember, the more load you put on the springs, the more load it causes elsewhere. So puts more load on the camshaft, more load on the push rods, more load on the valve seats, and on and on. So you don't want to be too much. Okay, so we'll go off and do the rest of them. So that's how you set up the installed height on a valve spring. So all of them need to be done, each one. So normally it will take you 10 or 15 minutes. You do need, if you're working on your own bike, you quite often will need to purchase more shims. It is possible perhaps to get an aftermarket shim to work, although I've got a heap at home that I've used in engines, and none of them are right. They're all too big. Huge, big, thick ones. They hit on the side of the cylinder head. Some of them are even causing problems with valve springs. So I'm a bit of a believer in, no matter what you're working on, whether it was a Ford, Holden, Moto Guzzi, Triumph, or anything else, if what component was in there, you use what originally was designed for the job, unless it's been remanufactured for it. Okay, let's do the rest of them.